Chapter 10, page 155. What goes up must come down. I spent the morning of August 26, 1883, or D-Day of the month of the Lamb in Krakatoa, as I had spent the morning before swimming and sunbathing on the delightful little nice fine coral beach. After having had a day of light eating at the C's Chinese restaurant, I attacked a Dutch breakfast at Mr. D's with gusto, a breakfast which included many cups of the richest, most delicious hot chocolate I have ever had the pleasure of drinking. I was afraid to go in swimming after such a huge meal, so I took a sun bath with my good friend Mr. F. for an hour or so when we reached the beach. I was pleased to see that I was getting quite tan. I got my first real burn when I made my bizarre nude arrival on Krakatoa. Added to it the day we flew to the balloon merry-go-round, and considerably darkened in the morning before the beach, so that I was fast losing my comparatively pale appearance, which so distinguished me at first from my fellow Krakatoans. "Up to now," said Mr. F., as the movement of the earth's surface rolled him over. "You have asked me many questions, which I have done my best to answer. I think now you know just about all there is to know about life on the island. Now I am going to ask you to tell me all you can think of in the way of news about my native city, San Francisco, a city from which you have just arrived, and which I haven't seen in over 7 years. "That's fair enough," I said. I then started to think of how best to do this. As a school teacher, I was pretty well tied down to a rather monotonous form of urban life, but I did get to know a lot of people. I conducted classes for children between the ages of 10 and 15, which was the ages of the children of the Krakatoan families. I reasoned, therefore, that the parents of the children I taught must have been the same age as Mr. F. I described San Francisco to him as a social columnist would, telling him about these people as if they were my closest friends, telling him what they were doing in terms of parties, minstrels, circuses, theaters, dinners, and whatever social functions I could remember having attended with any of them. This proved to be an excellent idea, for he had known some of the people I mentioned and had heard others talk about by friends of his on Krakatoa. I suppose one doesn't think of one's home in terms of streets and buildings as much as one does of personal associations, friends, and relatives. Whenever I mentioned a friend of his eyes lit up and he started firing all sorts of questions at me. He was amazed at the many details, stories, and anecdotes I could tell about their children. "You must be very fond of children," he said. "You seem to take such a humorous and sympathetic attitude towards stories of their classroom tricks and pranks." I still had no intention of telling anybody on the island that I had been a school teacher, but, of course, in telling Mr. F. about his friends in San Francisco, I had clear memories of their children, to whom I was subjected every day, then their parents, whose homes I only visited on rare and usually trying informal occasions. "Yes," I said, gritting my teeth, "I've always been close to children." I continued mentioning more people Mr. F. knew and recounting as many incidents as I could recall about them. I must say, Mr. F. was a good listener. He had been lying down flat on his back. He was now propped up on his elbows and seemed completely fascinated with my account. "Just a minute," he said. "I hate to interrupt you, but I have a wonderful idea. Everybody here is from San Francisco, and I am sure they would get the same thrill hearing of their old friends and of their friends' children as I am getting now. Would you possibly consider giving us all a talk, just like this one, in the dining room after lunch? I would be only too delighted, I said. Wonderful, said Mr. F. You can't imagine how much they'll like this. Our conversation here always seems eventually to get around to San Francisco, and we haven't had any real news of our old friends in years. We took a swim, let the sun dry us off, and returned to Mr. F's house. While I was dressing, Mr. F ran around to all the houses preparing everybody for the talk I was going to give. I was very pleased that in this simple way, I was perhaps going to be able to repay them for somewhat of their fabulous hospitality. We had a delicious lunch which consisted of huge portions of Javanese rishtafel, which is a Javanese rice cooked and curried as the Dutch do it in the Dutch Indies. Krakatoa is actually part of the Dutch Indies, though no Dutchman has ever cared to set foot on the island. We had lots of this hot rice and huge glasses of wonderful Javanese tea. I was pretty hot from the freshly acquired sunburn. I was warm inside from this delicious hot curry, and after several stimulating glasses of tea, I had a nice warm feeling all over and was well prepared to give my talk. Mr. F waited until all the tables had been cleared by the D family, then placed a chair on one of those tables. He silenced the crowd, introduced me as the speaker in a most informal and nice way, looked at me, and pointed to the chair. I climbed up to the table, sat down, and after the 20 families were all comfortably settled, began my talk. The response to it was amazing and most gratifying. Each time I mentioned a new name, at least one face in the audience would light up. There would be much nudging of elbows, smiles, and faraway homesick looks. Giving this simple talk, which seemed to bring so much genuine pleasure to these people, was a tremendous joy to me. While I was talking, all eyes were attentively fixed on me, and I was looking around the room, catching the reactions to each new name I mentioned and thinking of up incidents to talk about next. Looking out the window, I noticed that the ground seemed a little more active than usual. Being a new citizen of the island, I didn't know whether there was anything unusual about this at first. I went on with my talk. As I recall it, before being most rudely interrupted by a singularly sinister event, I had talked over 3 hours. I noticed that the earth was moving with increasing violence. I looked at my watch. The movement of the earth's surface usually subsided completely for a few minutes out of each hour. But that afternoon, it had been getting increasingly violent over a period of 2 hours. This was quite alarming. I called this to the attention of the other people. They all turned and looked out the windows. Some of them didn't seem at all alarmed, but others looked quite frightened. I was far from feeling at ease. Mr. M walked over to the window and looked out. After a few minutes, he said, "I don't think it's anything to get much alarmed over. But after all, most of our houses were knocked down in 77. But they were simple huts," said Mr. T. "I know, but they had diamond foundations too. This house hasn't shown any signs of the slightest vibration. Please go on with your talk, Professor Sherman." This seemed to reassure everyone considerably, though I can't say my heart was in my speech as much as before. I noticed that my audience was rather restless too. Suddenly, and this was a sight which is as vivid to me now as it was when I first saw it, the wall opposite of me slowly and almost noiselessly opened up in a crack large enough to allow the sun to shine through. It was the most terrifying and sinister sight I have ever seen. A considerable amount of powdered plaster dropped on the heads of the families in the room, and the windows near the cracked wall broke open. The windows had all been closed so that the usual noise of the mountain wouldn't interfere with my talk. Now, through the crack in the wall and through the broken windows, the rumblings of the mountain thundered in full force.